Good morning. My name is Jane Tang. I head up the Advanced Analytics Group at Vision Critical. And today, I want to talk about a conjoint experiment. In particular, I want to talk about how conditioning via broad versus narrow categories were able to alter the price sensitivity you observe in the conjoint experiment. So set this up a little bit. What we're saying is when we conduct a conjoint study, there's quite often a lot of other questions that are being asked before the actual conjoint exercise itself begins. So for example, we set up screening criteria, we ask their demographic information, we talk about what current products they use and all that kind of questions before the conjoint exercise. What I'm saying today is that the response category that you use in these questions provides a type of conditioning and does then affect the choices they make in the conjoint section and altering the respondent's price sensitivity. Here's an example of that conditioning. So here we are simply asking respondents to tell us their age. We can either give them very broad scale groups. So here on the left-hand side, we have 4 answering categories covering all the possible ages, but they're very broad in that sense. And on the right-hand side, on the other hand, it's the same, covers the entire age scale again, but there's 14 points in here, and each of these points are very narrow. So this is the type of conditioning I'm referring to. Before I get into the rest of this talk, I want to introduce you to my co-authors. So Amitabh, Vicky, and Gautam are our 3 academics I was working with on this paper. Their paper called Categories Create Mindsets, the Effects of Exposure to Broad versus Narrow Categorizations on Subsequent Unrelated Decisions, is essentially the motivation behind our current paper. And this is published on the Journal of Marketing Research in 2010. The basic premises, I should say the next few slides here are actually slides from a talk that Vicky gave at the Art Forum. The basic premises here is that the scale type you use in one decision context, such as the broad, when people are exposed to either the broad or the narrow scale, would then affect how their judgments and decisions made in their subsequent unrelated decisions from a second context. So here's here's the manipulations I mean. So for example, here on the left-hand side, the respondents are exposed to the broad scales. They were asked to tell us about themselves, whether they're introverted or extroverted, tell us about their eye color and hair color and what type of cast they would adopt. But all of the responses they can give are very broad scales. So very broad color type of eye colors and hair color and cats. And on the right-hand side is the second type of exposure is the other half the respondent would be exposed to. They're still being asked the same exact question and providing the same exact answers, but the answers they're given is on the 9-point scale for describing themselves. And there's much more different shades of the eye color and slightly different shades of hair color as well. Similarly with the cats as well, there's more narrow groupings in the type of cats that they each can choose to adopt. So the study is, in this study, the respondent would be randomly exposed to one of these conditions. The first study I want to talk about is how that type of condition have an effect on object sorting. So this is a fairly simple exercise where we simply ask the respondent, after they have been exposed to that conditioning, to sort these 12 fruits into groups. They can sort it into as many groups as they want or as few as they want. They just have to put these fruits into similar groups. The results is this. What we're looking at here is the average number of groups people created. The respondents who were exposed in the broad conditioning group created on average 3.2 groups. And those respondents who were exposed to the narrow conditioning created on average 4.6 groups. And so the people in the narrow groups created significantly more groupings. What's really interesting is that if you take a visual inspection of the fruit, the groupings people actually created, there is a qualitative difference in how the participants created those groupings. Now, those respondents that are in the broad conditioning group, they created simple groupings based on either color, so you have the red group versus the yellow group, or taste, so you have some people grouping fruits that are sweet versus sour. Now, in contrast to those in the narrow conditioning, they created these groupings often with more than one criterion in mind. So instead of just color or just taste, they created groupings that based on in combination of that. So you end up with a red and sweet group, and you end up with a red and sour group, and you end up with another yellow and sweet group, etc. And that's how they were able to generating a greater number of groups. So what it seems happened is they organized the fruits in a more careful and more complex manner, acknowledging that there are facts multiple dimensions in which these groups, these fruits can actually be different from each other. The second study I want to talk about is a category inclusion task. So again, similarly, a respondent will be either exposed to the narrow or the broad conditioning first, and then they get this task. They're shown essentially a continuum of Chinese versus Western European faces. And they were shown this one at a time from the left to the right. And for each face, they were asked them to check click on the appropriate button, whether they think this face is a Chinese face or they're not sure. And the results of this conditioning is that those who were exposed to the broad scales accepted the greater number of faces to be Chinese. So on average, people who were exposed to the broad conditioning thought just over half of these faces could be considered Chinese. But the respondents who were exposed to the narrow conditions thought only really the first two faces, maybe the third one, could really be considered Chinese. So I just want to review what we have here. So what we're saying is by conditioning respondents through either the broad category scales or the narrow category scales, we are able to change the way they process information. When respondents are exposed to the broad scales, they are more lenient. They tend to be slightly less careful. Their decisions are less conceptually complex. They considered fewer dimensions in their decisions, and these tend to be the more salient dimensions. And when they are exposed to the narrow conditioning, their decisions they're a little more critical, and they're more careful, and their decisions are more conceptually complex. And in their decisions, they take into consideration multiple dimensions, both the salient and the non-salient aspect are taken into consideration. And so this then essentially leads us to the finding of our study. In the grouping task, people are able to make fewer and larger groups when they're exposed to the broader scale, and they made many and smaller groups when they're exposed to the narrow scale. And in the categorization task, they used more lenient inclusion criterion when they're exposed to the broad scales, and they used a stricter inclusion criteria when they're exposed to the narrow group. So this then leads to our current study. We want to know whether that same change in the information processing style would affect people, how people approach conjoint tasks. So what we're saying is, if people we're hypothesizing is that when people are exposed to the broad scales, they would then focus on fewer product features. And because price is often the most salient and most noticeable attributes in a conjoint task, when respondents focus on fewer product features during the conjoint task, they would then rely more on price for their decisions and become more price sensitive. Now, similarly, if when the respondents are exposed to the narrow conditions, they would focus more on more product features, and price become less salient, and so they become less, they rely less on price and become less price sensitive. So this is the experiment we end up running. We made up a category called mobile internet devices, which essentially is just a very simplified smartphone that allows you to take emails and make calls, use the GPS, but not none of the not the more interesting apps or anything like that. So it's a fairly basic smartphone, but we called it a mobile internet device, and we presented the study as such. This is the way the questionnaire was set up. We asked a bunch of screening questions about whether you're the decision maker, your gender, age, occupation, what you currently own, what you plan to buy, and we asked them about their current, how they're currently using the devices they have, and what their plans for the device they plan to buy. They were introduced to the MID concept itself, and then we asked them to evaluate the concept. The key part of this is all of these questions that are highlighted in blue here are essentially questions that we're using for the conditioning. After this conditioning, everybody saw the same conjoint exercise, got the same introduction, saw the same conjoint exercise, and got the same profiling information as well. And this is the type of scale manipulation we were applying. So there's a previous example for the age category. I used 4 scale points in the broad group and 14 in the narrow group, and we did the same thing when we asked people about their occupation. Again, the broad group had 4, and the narrow group actually got 39 different occupations to sort through. Then we asked them about their devices to plan. We asked them about frequency of usage of such device and the evaluation of the product concept. All of these with the broad group got very broad category response scales, and the narrow group got narrow response scales. This is the conjoint task we shown to the respondent. Respondents are asked to evaluate 5 different options of the MID product based on connectivity, internet browsing, email, GPS, phone, storage, and price. And they were asked the 5-point purchase intent. They were asked to select the one they most preferred, and then would you actually buy the product, the mobile device you selected above, just like what Kevin was referring to there. And here's the results of that. What happened here is that it matched our expectations. So the narrow group, the people who were exposed to the narrow condition, paid much more attention to internet browsing. They paid more attention to GPS, and they paid more attention to the phone features. And then because they paid more attention to those, they placed relatively less importance on the price factor. And the broad conditioned group, because they paid less attention to the actual product features, they relied more on price. And here's the price elasticity. So in this case, when the broad group were during the simulation, we said that here's an average mid product. If it's for sale at $99, how likely would you buy? And it says 18%. With the simulation is telling us 18% of the people would buy that mid product. And when the price went up to $499, only 5% of the respondent would actually purchase it. And the similar numbers for the narrow group. What's interesting here is because the narrow group paid more attention to the product features and less to price, they become less price sensitive. That's why the narrow group has a more inelastic price elasticity. So to just kind of in conclusion, what we're able to demonstrate is that the conditioning respondent received prior to the conjoint via the nature of the response category matters. What I guess the implication of this research is, should we or can we strategically make use of this type of conditioning to make respondents and consumer pay more or less attention to certain type of information? I do a lot of work in the technology category. So in this category, for example, a lot of our conjoint exercises focuses a lot on the product itself, on the various functions the product would allow you to do. So what tends to happen is it draws attention away from the respondent, the attention they would have paid to price than what would have been in a real situation, meaning that they tend to be less price sensitive than they would have been in the real world situation. So would it help if we simply given respondents the broader conditioning right off the bat, so to make them more attuned to paying attention to the price cue? Or vice versa. I know that when I do work in the CPG product, when you talk to a respondent about how they buy toilet papers or shampoo and whatnot, the experiment is often set up so that the price may not be the only thing that varies, but quite often is the thing that draws more attention, more respondents' attention to it. So in that case, they often actually display more price sensitivity than they would in the real life when you go shopping at a grocery store, and quite often there's much less attention paid to price. So in that sense, if we were able to conditioning respondent to pay more attention to price, less attention to price, would that help in a conjoint situation? So that's all I have to say. Can I give the control back to you, Ray?